The year is 1607. On the rocky, wind-battered coast of Maine, 120 English settlers step off two ships and onto a shore that no European power has yet tamed. They call it the Popham Colony. Within a year, it will be gone. Abandoned, burned, or simply erased. No war destroyed it, no plague wiped it out, and yet almost no one has heard of it, while its sister colony to the south, Jamestown, became the origin story of a nation. This is the story of the English settlement history chose to forget, and the questions it left behind that still haven't been answered. In the early 1600s, England was racing to catch up. Spain had colonized much of the Americas for nearly a century. France was pushing into the north. English merchants and investors, hungry for gold, timber, and a foothold in the New World, formed the Virginia Company, split into two branches. The London Company would settle the south. The Plymouth Company would settle the north. In the spring of 1607, both companies launched expeditions at nearly the same time. One landed at Jamestown, Virginia. The other, 5 weeks later, landed at the mouth of the Kennebec River on the coast of what is now Maine. This northern expedition carried two ships, the Gift of God and the Mary and John, and was led by two men, George Popham, an older, experienced administrator appointed president of the colony, and Raleigh Gilbert, a younger, ambitious nobleman serving as his second in command. Roughly 120 colonists came ashore on August 13, 1607, at a peninsula they named Sabino Point. They immediately began construction of a fortified settlement they called Fort St. George, complete with a storehouse, a chapel, officers' quarters, and cannon emplacements facing the sea. This was not a ragtag landing. Fort St. George was, for its time, one of the most heavily fortified English positions in North America. The colonists came prepared for permanence. They brought livestock, tools, and shipwrights. And in the months that followed, they accomplished something Jamestown did not. They built a ship. The Virginia of Sagadahoc, a 30-ton pinnace, was constructed on the banks of the Kennebec and became the first English vessel built in the Americas. It would later cross the Atlantic and prove seaworthy enough to sail again. By any measure, this was a colony built to last, but Maine in the 17th century was not Virginia. The winter of 1607 into 1608 was brutal. Later analysis of tree, ring, and climate data places this period within the broader stretch of the Little Ice Age, when North Atlantic winters ran colder and harsher than they do today. Supplies dwindled. The chapel and storehouse offered little comfort against a New England winter the colonists were entirely unprepared for. And then, in February of 1608, George Popham, the colony's president, the steady hand holding the settlement together, died. The exact cause was never definitively recorded, though cold illness and the sheer physical toll of the winter are the leading explanations. With Popham dead, command fell to Raleigh Gilbert. And here the story takes its first real turn. Gilbert was younger, more volatile, and by most surviving accounts, less suited to hold together a struggling settlement through crisis. Relations with the local Abenaki people, who had initially engaged in cautious trade with the English, grew increasingly strained. Some historical accounts describe tension bordering on hostility, though there is no clear record of large-scale violence. What is clear is that the fragile trust between colonists and the indigenous population that Jamestown, for all its own catastrophic failures, managed to maintain a little longer, seems to have eroded faster at Popham. Then, in the fall of 1608, a supply ship arrived from England carrying grim news for Gilbert personally. His older brother had died, leaving Gilbert an inheritance and a title back home. He now had a reason, arguably a stronger pull than anything the colony offered him, to return to England immediately. And this is where the story becomes genuinely strange, because when the ship sailed back for England that autumn, it didn't carry a few colonists home for the winter. It carried nearly everyone. The entire colony, all remaining settlers, abandoned Fort St. George and returned to England less than 14 months after they had arrived. Jamestown, founded the same year, suffered starvation, disease, and violent conflict with the Powhatan so severe that colonists resorted to cannibalism during the starving time, and it survived. Popham, by comparison, faced a hard winter and the death of one leader, and the entire settlement simply walked away. Why? The official explanation, recorded by contemporary chroniclers like William Strachey, cites a combination of factors: Popham's death, Gilbert's sudden inheritance and departure, the harshness of the winter, and a growing belief among the colonists' backers in England, particularly Sir John Popham, George's uncle, and one of the colony's chief financial sponsors, who died that same year, that the venture was not going to yield the profits investors expected. Without steady leadership and without the promise of gold or a lucrative trade route, the will to continue seems to have simply evaporated. But historians have never been fully satisfied with this tidy narrative, and that's where the mystery deepens. For nearly 4 centuries, the exact location of Fort St. George was lost. Unlike Jamestown, which remained continuously known and eventually became a major archaeological and historical site, Popham's fort vanished from the landscape entirely. The wooden structures rotted. The land was reused. Maps drawn from colonial era sketches were vague enough that historians debated the settlement's precise location for generations. Some speculated it had eroded into the sea. Others weren't sure it had ever been built exactly where the records claimed. It wasn't until 1994 that archaeologist Jeffrey Brain, working with a team of researchers, finally located and began excavating the actual site of Fort St. George on the Sabino Point Peninsula. What they found confirmed the fort's existence and layout: foundation trenches, artifacts, evidence of the storehouse and living quarters, matching contemporary drawings made by colonist John Hunt in 1607, which had survived in Spanish archives, of all places, after being intercepted by Spanish spies monitoring English colonial activity. That detail alone is worth sitting with. The most detailed surviving map of the Popham Colony wasn't preserved by the English who built it. It was captured by Spanish intelligence and filed away in Spain's imperial archives, where it sat forgotten for centuries before historians rediscovered it. England's foothold in the north was, in effect, documented for posterity by its rival. Excavations also uncovered evidence that has quietly complicated the hasty abandonment theory. Artifacts recovered from the site suggest a level of organization and continued activity inconsistent with a colony in complete collapse or panic. The shipbuilding operation that produced the Virginia of Sagadahoc, in particular, represented a massive, coordinated investment of labor and resources, not the behavior of a group of desperate settlers simply trying to survive the season. Someone was still planning for a future in that harbor right up until the decision was made to leave. So why did they really go? Was it purely economic? Investors back in London losing faith once initial hopes of gold or a Northwest Passage route failed to materialize? Was it the psychological blow of losing Popham, compounded by a leadership vacuum that Gilbert, distracted by his inheritance, had no real interest in filling? Or was there a deeper, undocumented breakdown with the Abenaki that the official English record simply chose not to preserve? A conflict too damaging to England's colonial reputation to commit to paper? The honest answer is that no single surviving document gives a complete picture. The people who could have explained the full truth left no diary, no confession, no detailed internal account of the colony's final weeks. What remains is a patchwork, a few official letters, second-hand chronicles written after the fact, a captured map, and buried foundations pulled from the Maine soil nearly 400 years later. What's certain is this: for 1 year, Fort George stood as one of the most ambitious English footholds in North America, fortified, organized, and building ships to cross the Atlantic. And then, in the space of a single autumn, it emptied out entirely, its buildings left to rot, its story left out of the textbooks that would later canonize Jamestown as the first permanent English settlement. Popham wasn't permanent, but it was first in other ways. First English ship built in the Americas, one of the first attempts at self-sustaining English infrastructure on the continent. And it vanished so completely that it took modern archaeology to prove it had ever truly existed at all. Maine's coastline has quietly buried more than just a fort. It buried a version of American colonial history that doesn't fit the narrative most people were taught. One where the first English colony to truly commit to leaving didn't fail through massacre or starvation, but through something far harder to document: a slow, collective decision to walk away for reasons the historical record still can't fully explain. If stories like this, the ones history left in the margins, are the ones that interest you, this is exactly what Grim State is built for. Subscribe, And join us as we keep digging up the parts of American history that were never supposed to stay buried.